This is Quercus agrifolia, coast live oak, and you're looking at a standard version or a single trunk. This is probably a 30-year-old plus tree. It's probably about 35 to 40 feet wide and about 30 feet tall, plus or minus. And that's pretty typical. As these get older, they're a little wider than they are tall. They kind of cap out. Typically, I'd say you'd say a 40 to 50 foot tall plant by 60 to 70 feet wide is a very mature one. This is a low branching variety, and you can buy them and specify them either way. They naturally grow like a big bush. You're going to see that in a moment. And here they've just trained lower branches as opposed to training it with a single trunk. These are usually propagated from acorns, which you'll see in a moment. And because of that, you get a fair amount of variety between the shape and density of the tree. I've noticed that in the leaves also you see some variety. So whenever you do something from a seed, you do get some more variation than if you would if you were doing cuttings. So these are being used as a street tree and a greenbelt tree in a nice subdivision in Pleasanton, California. The temperature range for these is down to around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and these are growing in a very hot inland valley. Well, during the summer it's 90 to 100 degrees on a regular basis. It's very dry here. The humidity is in the high teens most of the summer, so these are used to that. These have a very waxy cup-shaped leaf that protects them from losing a lot of moisture. And these typically grow with a taproot. Now, when you're buying one that's a nursery plant, you're not going to get that taproot on there, but they are deep-rooted and very good at procuring water, so they're super drought resistant. This is a young one just growing in a field, and it's probably about 12 feet wide and maybe 10 to 12 feet tall, and just growing the way they naturally do. So I wanted to show you this. If you're using kind of a native planting, that would be how they'd start off. And then this is probably 3 to 5 years older. I'd say this is 20 feet tall by about the same width. And again, very dense, does not naturally develop a single trunk, is more of a multi-trunk kind of a plant. And unless somebody goes in and prunes these, you can see how dense they become. Here is a shot of the leaves and some acorns on there. This is taken at the in mid-fall, and you're seeing a little leaf droppage here. Those yellow leaves will be falling off. These do a pretty major leaf shed in the spring, by the way, and replace most of the leaves on the plant, so they can be pretty messy for that reason. Also, I've seen moths really go after this every few years in our area, where, especially in the Monterey area, some type of moth infests these, and the caterpillars take over the tree and almost defoliate it, and then they do their thing and move on. I've never heard of it killing the trees, but it sure makes a mess of them. So as a design, using this in design, the most common use is probably using it as a standard, but also on slope plantings and more native style plantings where somebody's looking for an evergreen tree. This is a really good candidate in California in general, because it's got a nice growth rate. It's very drought tolerant, can basically be shut off after there's been an establishment period for the tree in terms of water. And the only downside is these are susceptible to sudden oak death. And that's a disease that has been affecting a number of plant varieties that are indigenous to California. And I would say, though, since I've heard about the disease, I've only seen a couple of trees die from this, so it's not like this is wiping out all of the trees. On the other hand, sometimes these diseases start to evolve and do more damage, but as of now, it hasn't stopped us from using these. Because of the leaf drop and the acorn drop, these can be fairly messy. You see here, these are used in a green belt, and I think that's a very effective way to do that. I'm not a big proponent of using these over paving. I've had clients that had them around deck areas, and they just they're so messy over such a long period. That's a real problem. So I think in a design sense, you need to be aware of that, that these do put down a big mess over a fairly long period of time, because you have the acorn droppage in the fall and summer, and then you also get the leaf shed in the spring. And between the two, it's pretty substantial, especially as the plant gets older. And if you wanted to use a more native type of planting where nobody's going to be taking care of the plant, this is what you'd expect to see if you used a multi-trunk or low branching, whereas this is what they'll turn into if you use a standard. That tree, by the way, is probably 20 years old plus or minus, and it's about 25 to 30 feet tall and wide. That whole grouping is. There's 3 or 4 there along that green belt. So to give you a sense of size over time. Oh, and water is really important to understand on this. These the Quercus agrifolia, coast live oak, can take a lot of water if they're grown from nursery plants and established that way. I have seen these in lawns and they just did fine. It's when you don't want to add water to an existing native oak. That's a good way to kill it. But if you establish it on water because it's in amongst other plants that need that, you really shouldn't have a problem with that, and that's an important distinction. Here's one in a park. This is probably 40 feet wide by 30 to 35 feet tall, and it's about a 30-year-old oak tree. The trunk on that's probably 16 inches in diameter, and they get a nice gray, smooth bark on them, which makes them pretty easy to distinguish from the other oaks that we see here in California. And again, here's a upright formed low branching version of the oak, and you can again use these either way. They're fairly dense. I mean, that's the thing. They're easy to see from a long ways away and know what you're looking at least in our area, because there's nothing else quite like them. They have small leaves. And let's talk about those. These are holly-like. You see how they cup over, and then they have little thorns on the edges of the leaf. So that's something to understand. When these dry and they're on the ground, if you step on them, they're very thorny. So that's another reason you have to be careful about where you use them, because the leaves can become a nuisance if you're wanting to walk in that area at all. They do get a bit thorny. They're not terrible to handle like a holly, but they do have that little bit of a needle on there, and again, it's worse when they dry than when they're green. I think that's what I can tell you about Quercus agrifolia. Those are the main things to consider. Very low water once established, can be used in drought tolerant situations, but also flexible, can handle more water if you're trying to combine them with other things that need that. Good growth rate, by the way. They grow probably 1.5 to 3 feet per year when they're younger. And that surprises a lot of people, but if they're in a green belt where they're getting food and water, they will grow that fast, so be aware of that. And that is Quercus agrifolia, coast live oak. Enjoy.